It was a murder case that changed the way society looked at murder. How could a person be victim to violence? Violence that is witnessed by around a dozen people and no one attempted to help them. Kitty Genovese, known by the nickname Kitty, was one such victim, and she paid with her life. Her case led to the coining of the phrase Genovese syndrome, otherwise known as the bystander effect. And it seems perhaps equally as frightening to be killed in public as it is to know that groups of people could watch and there'd be no one willing to help you. Kitty was born in 1935 in New York City to an Italian family and had 4 siblings, of which she was the eldest. She lived in Park Slope, a prominently Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn. As the oldest child, she had a lot of responsibility, which she took on gracefully. She was known to be incredibly mature for her age, very self-confident and optimistic. She was the kind of girl destined to go far in life, or so her loved ones hoped. Kitty ended up finding love and getting engaged as she graduated high school, but her family was moving away to Connecticut, ironically because her mother had witnessed a murder and didn't feel safe in the city anymore. To continue to prepare for marriage, Kitty remained behind in the city and was married in 1954. However, the love didn't last and the marriage was soon annulled before the end of that same year. Kitty worked to get her life back towards something more normal after the separation and moved into an apartment in Brooklyn. She took on a number of clerical jobs, none of which she enjoyed doing. By the end of the 1950s, Kitty had taken a job as a bartender. She did well in this position and moved up to manage Ev's 11th Hour bar in Queens. She also had an apartment in the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens and had met a new love interest, a woman named Mary, who Kitty had met in 1963. Kitty shared her apartment with Mary and things seemed to be looking up. Unfortunately, the relationship wouldn't last even a year, as a threat was looming around the corner. The same type of violence Kitty's family moved to get away from would find its way into Kitty's life and snuff it out in the form of a heartless predator. Kitty had just gotten out of work. It was about 2:30 a.m. She got into her car, a red Fiat, and began heading home. On her way, she stopped at one of the many traffic lights that littered the area, and it was while she was stopped that she was spotted by a man named Winston Mosley. It took Kitty 45 minutes to get home that morning. She parked her car by the railroad parking lot. Kitty's apartment door was located in an alleyway at the rear of the building, which was the perfect place for an attacker to strike. She was parked about 100 feet away from her apartment door when she noticed Winston approaching her with a large hunting knife firmly in hand. Fear and panic overwhelmed her. She began running for the door as Winston chased her, and he quickly caught up and sent the blade of his knife thrusting into her back 2 times. The blade shot deep into her body and tore into her organs. Kitty managed to cry out for help, saying, "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Help me." A number of witnesses heard the cries, and one neighbor shouted at Winston, saying, "Let that girl alone." Winston, now knowing he'd been seen, ran off into the night, and Kitty struggled slowly, painfully, to get to her apartment door while blood flowed freely from her wounds. What happened next is considered incredibly bizarre for a civilized society. Kitty made it to the door in a small hallway at the end of the building, only to find it locked, and she collapsed onto the ground and lay there for 10 minutes without anyone coming to her aid. But eventually a man did enter the hallway, wearing a wide-brimmed hat which kept his face hidden in the shadows. Much to Kitty's horror, it was Winston again. He had returned to finish what he'd started. Witnesses watched him enter the alleyway and heard Kitty struggle as she tried to defend herself from his vicious stabbing. He punctured her numerous times with the blade and cut up her hands as she tried desperately to fight him off. Kitty was resilient and clung to life even after the second vicious attack, but the horror wasn't over. Winston tore open Kitty's clothes and raped her there, covered in her blood. He then stole $49 from her and vanished. The attack took around half an hour, and not a single person, not a neighbor nor an officer, came to her rescue. Eventually, a neighbor did come to see what was going on after the attack was over. Without knowing if Winston had fled already, she approached Kitty as she was taking her last breaths. She held her in her arms and tried to comfort her the best she possibly could. A few minutes after the final attack, another witness called police, who arrived within 10 minutes after the call was made. Kitty was picked up by ambulance at 4:15 a.m. and died before she reached the hospital. Her body was buried in a family grave in Connecticut, in the town her family had moved to in order to escape the kind of violence that claimed Kitty's life. While some sources claimed upwards of 38 people had witnessed some part of the attack, police investigation found around a dozen people who had witnessed at least part of the attack and didn't think to help because they believed it was perhaps a lover's quarrel and it was best not to get involved, among other reasons like thinking they were possibly both drunk. It had become known that a lot of news sources had reported erroneously on Kitty's murder and had over-exaggerated the incident to make the onlookers look even more unwilling to help than they actually were. Still, the case made headlines for how long it took for any person to actually act in order to help Kitty. Winston Moseley wasn't captured for 6 days, and it was possibly only because he was caught burglarizing a house. He had no prior criminal record and was married with 3 children. While in custody, he confessed to Kitty's murder. Police wondered why he would just suddenly throw himself into a life of murder and crime, especially when he had a family. He said he just wanted to kill a woman. They were easier and didn't fight back, he claimed. He quietly got out of bed the night of Kitty's murder, careful not to wake his sleeping wife by his side. Creeping out of the house and getting to his car at around 2:30 a.m., he went out cruising for a victim. That's when he encountered Kitty. Winston was rather chatty with police, openly admitting that he had murdered and sexually assaulted 2 other women and had committed 30 to 40 burglaries and an undetermined number of rapes. He was a very disturbed individual, to say the least, and a psychiatric evaluation suggested that Winston was also a necrophile, a person who has a sexual attraction to dead bodies. Winston attempted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but the jury wasn't buying it. They took 7 hours to deliberate and found Winston guilty. 4 days later, at his sentencing, Winston received a death sentence for Kitty's murder alone. Winston was expressionless as the sentencing was read to the courtroom, which erupted partially into applause and cheering. The judge was against capital punishment, but this didn't stop him from agreeing with the sentencing. He told the court that he didn't believe in capital punishment, but when he sees a monster like Winston Moseley, he wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch himself. But Winston wasn't given an opportunity to argue his medical insanity during the sentencing hearing, and he had only been determined to be legally sane in the trial. Because of this, his death sentence was reduced to life in prison. But Winston wasn't finished living his deplorable lifestyle, and he wasn't going to let prison stop him so quickly. In 1968, Winston injured himself purposely and had to be transported to a hospital in Buffalo, New York for minor surgery. He used the ride back to prison as his opportunity to escape and did so by striking the officer who was transporting him and taking his weapon before fleeing to a vacant house owned by Matthew Gavagan and his wife. He remained in the house undetected for 3 days before the couple dropped in to check on the house, only to find Winston there. He bound and gagged Matthew and raped his wife. He then fled the house, took their car, and was gone. He found another home that he quickly broke into, occupied by a mother and daughter. He held them hostage for 2 hours and then released them. Thankfully, this time, for whatever reason, aside from being scared, the 2 women were entirely unharmed. He turned himself into police a short time later and was given another 2 additional 15-year sentences with his life sentence. Winston went on to participate in the Attica prison riot, one of the most noteworthy prison riots in history, where a number of prison officers and other employees, along with inmates, were killed. And in 1984, shockingly enough, Winston was up for parole. During his hearing, he tried to get the parole board to accept a different perspective on criminals, a more warped perspective. He said that prisoners like himself were victims also, because the victim only had to deal with the crime being committed for perhaps an hour or even only a minute, but the person who committed the crime had to pay for the rest of their lives. He went on to claim that he never intended to kill Kitty, and that sometimes people just die during muggings, as if he shouldn't be blamed for something that was so out of his control. The parole board saw through his remorseless absurdity and denied him. In fact, they denied him a total of 18 times. Winston didn't live to try for 19. He died in prison on March 28, 2016, at 81 years old, and is known to be one of the longest-serving inmates in the New York State prison system. Since the murder, the bystander effect has been studied at great length, with some researchers determining that the more people witnessing a violent event, the less likelihood the victim is going to get help, as people feel less willing when more eyes are on them, and the more people who aren't helping, the less likely anyone else will want to jump in to help. Though what exactly happened that night is unknown. Whether people did ignore Kitty's cries or the news reported falsely and it wasn't nearly as heartless as it was made out to be, the bystander effect and the case of Kitty Genovese are still often talked about by psychology professors to take a glimpse into a startling flaw of the human mind. Kitty's case is one of much debate, as is the bystander effect as a whole. We must only hope that we aren't caught in a situation where we put the bystander effect theory to the test. That's all for this episode. Be sure to check out my other videos by pressing here, and of course, be sure to subscribe to my channel by pressing up here, because you won't want to miss what's next. And I'll see you next time.